everybody. Thank you for coming to our first spring semester exhibition. Tonight we welcome Melissa Wilkinson. Please mark your calendars for March 31st when we welcome Liz Enns, a sculptor and installation artist, so this place will be completely converted. And then also we will be wrapping up the semester on May 9th for the senior thesis exhibitions, which are always an exciting event. Before I introduce you to Melissa, I'd like to take a quick moment to talk about a couple of things. First off, the Knott Gallery. It's a little but formidable gallery space that we have outside these doors. We created this space originally for student exhibitions. In the past, we coordinated these exhibitions kind of as a need-be, alternative space, experimental space, overflow, so on and so forth, and worked well for that. But what we're trying to do is we're going to rebrand it a little bit, professionalize it a little bit for you guys. And so we are going to coordinate exhibitions. We're thinking about timing them, potentially some of them with visiting artists so that you have a broader public audience. You would be potentially up here talking briefly about your work or the exhibition that you coordinated before the visiting artist comes. My boss isn't looking, she's nibbling on food, so I'm going to say something without checking with her. We might provide some nickels to throw together for a reception for different kinds of things. Maybe we could have a lunchtime thing. At any rate, we want it to be a professional experience where you install it, you kind of create the exhibition, the reception, you work with the install. I have the kind of formal paperwork that any visiting artist has to go through here. So we want to kind of offer that experience, but we do want it to be a lively space, so I'm not going to put up one exhibition and have it last for the full semester. So there's going to be kind of a rotating schedule. So if you're interested in doing that, talk to me or talk to your professors, and we'll get you kind of going through that process. Currently, we have an exhibition by an alum, 2017 alum, Julian Rigsby, whose work was talking about looking at the self, looking about consumption through social media, and that was part of his senior thesis body of work there. We're going to bring Sean up just for a few minutes and talk about scholarships, and then we'll get started.
Hello, I'm glad to have so many of you here. I am not authorized to tell you the following secret, but I will tell you anyhow. The faculty actually like you a lot. And we'd love to see you grow and be successful. Don't tell anyone I told you. One of the best ways for you to grow and to be successful is to get a line on your resume and to get free money. The easiest way to get a line on your resume and free money is to apply for the department scholarships. What you're going to see tomorrow, as soon as I can get the printer to work, is a poster that talks about the scholarships that has a QR code on it. Use this magic QR code, which is not made by the devil, don't worry, anyhow. Use this magic QR code to get on the Google form to apply for the scholarships. The applications are due by Wednesday, March the 5th at 5 o'clock. That's when it cuts off and no more applications come in. As you have questions about this process, please talk to any of the faculty because, again, you know why. And we want you to be successful, and this is a great way to do that.
Thank you, Sean. All right. So before we get started, I'm going to ask you to silence your phone. Melissa plans on talking for about 20, 25 minutes, give or take. If you have to leave before that, shame on you, but if you do, please do so in a courteous manner. Gather things quietly as you're leaving, kind of close the door manually, don't let it just slam. But again, hopefully you don't have to. For the last 22 years, Melissa Wilkinson has served as an academic, teaching at various academic institutions and workshops throughout the country. She received her BFA in painting from Western Illinois University in 2002, then went on to receive her MFA in painting from Southern Illinois University in 2006. Her work has been featured in wide-reaching publications throughout the country, including 3 editions of New American Paintings, the Curator's Salon, the Manifest Drawing Annual 4 times. She's shown in various galleries nationally, internationally, including South Korea, Canada, India, the Art Basel in Miami, has won, well, let's kind of breathe on that for a minute. That's incredible. It has won numerous awards throughout her career. She's won several fellowships, grants, including the Arkansas Arts Council Fellowship in Painting in 2012, Middle East Studies grant to create an image archive in Israel in 2016, and a National Woman in the Arts grant to do the same at Smithsonian in 2019. She's conducted workshops in the Arkansas Art Center, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and the Anderson Ranch Center in Snowmass, Colorado. She's represented in the On Center Gallery in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Her work is amongst private collections throughout the country and abroad. This is a cute part. She hikes regularly, enjoys making homemade pasta, enjoys kitchen experiments and fermentation that sometimes fail abysmally, and is in bed by 9 p.m. at the latest. She holds her studio at home in her lower Hudson Valley in Warwick, New York, and she serves as art faculty at the St. John Fisher University in Rochester. She hiked the Camino de Santiago 3 times, and it's not the reason I invited her here, just surreptitiously, we both are hikers, and she will be returning to the Scottish Highlands this summer to do the same, so I look forward to hearing from that. So, no further ado, please welcome Melissa.
I'm much shorter. All right, I'm fairly informal. If you have questions, just shoot it out, and I'm happy to answer them. I'm going to talk a lot about influences today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how my background plays a role in the choices that I make and what's up on the wall. I was a Navy brat. No, I am not this old. You're not laughing because you think I am this old, which is killing me inside. I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. I spent, literally, this is the view from the Sears Tower. It is the grid. It is all about the suburbs, and they extend as far as your eye can see. Oddly enough, it's incredibly diverse. I had a wonderful urban upbringing. I graduated from one of the largest high schools in the country, and my class was of 1,000 graduating. It was 5,000 students. I was for the most part, my mom was a single mom, and like many 80s children, my parents immediately got divorced. I was a ham and a giant tomboy. My favorite outfit was the Lone Ranger. But that lower left-hand corner photograph is of all 4 of us wearing mullets, and not the ironic kind. Very proud of it. But I spent the first 6 years of my life in a place called Gaeta, Italy. My father was in the military, like I said, and this is one of the strongholds left over from World War II. I literally grew up across the street from the Mediterranean with really, really magical memories. My brother would have a blow-up, see-through boat that he's 10 years older than me, so I was very, very small, and he would row us out to a place called Tit Mountain, and it was called that because it looked like a breast. And these are grottos that you can still visit today that were actually used by the ancient Romans to do performances. So I have very, very beautiful, aesthetic, fantasy-like memories of what my childhood was. When we got back from Italy, a formative memory was of the Challenger disaster, and many of you probably haven't heard of that, but I've got these 2 disparate images, which of course is the moon landing in 1969, and then my generation, which is like, I'm a millennial, but also like a latent Gen Xer, was watching this live on television. And this was one of the first NASA expeditions that included a teacher. So everybody had their classes gathered round to watch this expedition into space that blew up on live television. And I remember I was drawing on my stomach on the floor, and my father was behind me, and it happened, blew right up. And I remember looking behind me, with like question in my eyes about what was going on. I was 6. And he shrugged his shoulders, and that was it. And that is a Gen X upbringing, right there. When my parents separated and divorced, I was glued to the television set. Mind you, I spent 6 years in Italy, and we didn't have American television. We didn't have English-speaking television. So I was called the walking jingle because I memorized all of it. And I still, to this day, love screens and popular culture. I was weirdly fixated on men's muscular bodies. I watched WWF, and I would pose Conan the Barbarian, which, if you haven't seen it, you need to see it. I would pause that, and I would trace his body because I just was super interested in superheroes and these mythic figures and Jean-Claude Van Damme and that ridiculous splits he does in Bloodsport. I grew up during the AIDS epidemic in a suburb of Chicago. And so I grew up in a diversity is beyond how we characterize it. So I grew up in a very pluralistic culture. But because I grew up in the 80s, this was and it was an epidemic, where we lost an entire generation of gay men. And that's because of this guy. Reagan outwardly ignored the AIDS epidemic. In fact, when his wife's one of her best friends, who was a very famous actor who was dying of AIDS, she ignored it altogether and wouldn't acknowledge it. So it was this sort of quiet around an absolute chaotic event that lasted at least 15 years, was ignored by our politicians, that radicalized me. And then I went to college, and I was further radicalized. Always knew I wanted to be a painter, always. And I went to a state school, and I was trained by very traditional artists, like really traditional, like working from photographs was cheating, and you're gonna pay a model and work like it was the 19th century. And I did that for a while and it didn't really appeal to me, but I did figure out who I was along the way in terms of ideology. And I discovered realism. Realism as not a stylistic approach to painting, but realism as an ideological framework. Meaning, this guy, Gustave Courbet, who is the father of realism, said, "Show me an angel and I'll paint an angel." So he started to make paintings, and did throughout his career, that aggrandized and celebrated people who wouldn't have otherwise had a platform, people who were in the everyday, but also didn't have power. So these are men who are employed to literally break big stones into small stones all day long. And this is a 15-foot painting, right? So it's the scale of a history painting. And they're celebrated as noble. And this painting has since been destroyed, but it's that sort of thing that I carried with me to graduate school, where I figured out I was a postmodernist. I'm always getting into arguments with my wife about postmodernity because she thinks it's awful and cynical and just a joke. It is, and that's who I am. But if I were to actually distill what postmodernity is, then we're kind of in it. Some people say we're in postmodernity, but it's a reappraisal of modern assumptions relating to class, race, gender, all the things that like the traditionalists believed, we dismantle. It believes in appropriation and that the ownership of image is communal, that once something is out there, you can take it. Think about hip hop, right? You take from here, you put a rap on it, you figure it out, you remix it. It's postmodern. Globalization versus the individual. People now can reach people across the world in an instant, right? That is not something that I grew up with. And it uses satire or irony in order to provoke change or communicate very heavy messages. Think of South Park. Think of Family Guy, right? It's those mechanisms. It's a cartoon literally talking about really heavy things. And it didn't start with the Simpsons, but that's postmodern. And then, of course, it sees popular culture as a valid form of culture. Think Andy Warhol. I think of Andy Warhol as the very first postmodernist because he believed that you can cull from things that are widely known and that there isn't a highbrow and a lowbrow. And I pull from surrealism. As much as I hate Salvador Dali, I am interested in the psyche and the subconscious and the abstraction of bodily figures that become something else. And About 10 years ago, I came out to myself as a watercolorist. I was trained as an oil painter. I was trained to work big and grandiose and work traditionally. But honestly, I became a watercolorist in grad school because I believed it could do something different. I believe and still believe that it's been dismissed throughout our history as a sketchy material occupied by feminine people who occupy their Sundays by just doing these little things. You would have been trained as a 19th century woman of means to do watercolors because, it's art, but it wasn't art. So I really wanted to do something different with it. And this guy is in every single college dorm on a poster, and weirdly, even though I don't look at him, I think about him. Because I think about puzzles. So these are 2 puzzles cut with the same die. So if you look around at the work on the walls, you'll see that that's sort of in place. And I think a lot about Hellenistic sculpture. If you've ever been to the Vatican, it's one of the sexiest places on earth. It's filled with pagan sculptures, just like that. Very curious, isn't it? Yeah, but the reality is it's the transformation of something like stone, which is what this is, it's marble, into something incredibly beautiful, breathtaking, and sensual. Something hard into something incredibly human. I think a lot about Dutch still life and the emblems of the vanitas. And if you're not familiar with the vanitas was a 17th century Dutch preoccupation in still life that incorporated a couple of things. A reference to death, so it could be a skull, or the hunt, because it's a reminder of your mortality. All is vanity, vanitas. It's generally got a reference to time, might be a watch, might be bubbles, might be a sundial. It'll have an example of one of life's pursuits. Perhaps it could be a book, or a sculpture, or a palette, or a globe, right? But all of these things are in service of a reminder of your mortality, of the transience of life, of how quickly it can be snuffed away. So, in talking about influences, I'll talk about just a couple of bodies of work that are kind of like speaking with what's in here. I work typically in bodies of work, and not bodies of work, but series, right? Because I believe that, and this isn't disparaging, but I believe that each of my works do not necessarily stand on their own. They work much, much better in a space where they can be contextualized together, right? So I think of each show, weirdly, I've been talking about thesis projects all day. I think of my work as a thesis every time. And when I exhaust an idea, I move on into something completely different. Usually it's subject matter. So, what is Flash Cocotte? Flash Cocotte is a new kind of flash party, like flash mobs, but it's French. And it's a type of party that is pop-up the day of, that is only told to certain people in the know and spread on their social media, but it's only for queer people. And the reason why it's for queer people is not because it's like, elitist and exclusive, it's because it's a safe place. So these parties pop up in the night. And what they are, and what these pieces are ultimately about, are these spaces. Are these spaces that are secret, that are evocative of joy. Because a lot of people who make work about identity politics, like me, do not make work about the joy of being different. And I choose to do that. I think that's what's missing in queer politics today. Another body of work that I focused on was called the $3 icons. My mom used to say this thing. My mom's full of aphorisms, like old sayings. Down here in the South, that's really popular. But I'm full of them now, too, because I've turned into my mother. I have not turned into my mother. But I've picked up some things about my mother. She used to say, someone was a little queer as a $3 bill. And so I chose to adopt that old aphorism, which is of course deeply insulting, but why not reclaim it, into focusing on queer icons from the Hollywood golden era. Queer icons meaning, these are not queer individuals, even though Rock Hudson is. And Rock Hudson was that friend of Nancy Reagan, who she wouldn't visit, by the way. But, Betty Davis, right? These fairly conventional actors and actresses that are celebrated by the queer community for a variety of reasons. They might be a mess, right? Why is Britney Spears a queer icon? Because she's a mess and she's perfect at the same time, right? So what I did, this is the very first instance, and mind you, I make all of these digitally before I paint them, okay? So I just simply use Photoshop. I used to use actual collage and actually cut these images that I'd find in books, but I could play with scale in a way that was much more interesting and much more clever with using simply digital means. But this was the first instance that I had a very small intervention with the image. So I would make it into a shape, and then I would cut it and slide it. Slide it to the point where you could still recognize the source, you knew who you were looking at, Judy Garland, but you were also deeply uncomfortable looking at their face. And I did dozens and dozens and dozens of these, and this is the first time that my work sold. It was weird because people were playing this like, oh, I know that one. I know that one. Who's that one? Oh, is that so-and-so? And it really irritated me because that's not the game I wanted you to play, but okay, you're engaging with the work. You never know what's gonna happen when you put it out there. Well, from that work sparked the idea of the chimera. And you'll notice a couple of these series are called the chimera. A chimera is a mythical creature that is half lion, half goat, has the tail with a bunch of dragons on it, and it breathes fire. And it lives up, in ancient Greece, right? It's living up on the top of a mountain, and it would terrorize, the peasants. But what is the chimera? You know the chimera to potentially be something that's implied in science, right? We use the chimeric to basically mean hybrid today. And so I'm deeply interested in this sort of hybrid fracturing of two different things. So as a kid, I walk like this. And I was always a tomboy, and I really wanted to be friends with the boys, but they never let me play soccer, even though I was one of the best soccer players. And I never really fit, right? I just didn't fit. So that can be difficult when you identify as cisgender, like I do, I'm a woman, and you get called sir. It can stab you right in the heart. And so ultimately, I embarked on an entire series that is still ongoing of pairing both hyper-masculine traditional figures with hyper-feminine traditional figures. Very conventional, right? These expressions of gender performance that we have consumed from TV and movies, right? And so many of these are sourced from a variety of platforms. You'll see Betty Page, her legs. Betty Page was an early S&M model. S&M, yeah, that's what it means. She's right there and she's right there. But also you might have a model that's taken from a Bob Miser photograph, which he was a photographer for a magazine called Physique Pictorial. So all these poses that we have that bodybuilders use are taken from Physique Pictorial. And it initially started out as just a bodybuilder magazine, but it really appealed to gay men. And then eventually it came out as a gay magazine. Very clearly a gay magazine, pornography. And so a lot of those are taken from the old antiquated images. And I jumped right in. I made dozens and dozens and dozens of these. And so they take a little while to kind of land on something that works, but I have a really good visual memory, thank God. The rest of it's trash. Throw it away. Throw it in a heap, because my memory is a dumpster fire. But I'd have a good recollection of poses, and I keep very, very good archives of these things on my computer so that I know how to pair them, if that makes sense. And I play sometimes with the configuration. Yes, those are disco ball lights, because that's what I put in front of the installation there. So some of them are hung as grids, some of them are hung in groupings. It changes. If I sell one, whatever, I don't lose any sleep over it. And most of these are taken from celebrity portraits that have been pushed out into culture that are basically about beauty and glamour. And this is not my childhood, right? I don't know anything about the 50s or the 40s, right? I was born in 1980. So this is sort of this is more of an examination of our fixation on the gender performance as binary, right? Because if you don't fit into that, you are cast as one existing on the fringes. You make people uncomfortable. And that, that's not living in your own skin in a comfortable way. But ultimately, I'm not the first artist to do it. This is Lisa Lyon, who was a bodybuilder in the 80s. Granted, they look different, right? Because the 90s got crazy, and then they kind of went back to a normal kind of physique. But, they did a lot of testosterone. She was a fairly famous bodybuilder that Robert Mapplethorpe focused on. And as you probably all know, Robert Mapplethorpe died of AIDS. And he would appropriate these poses from art history. That's why it's really important to know art history, because we're all of the same lineage, no matter your background, no matter your identity, no matter your age. And that is a portrait of Zeus throwing, it was thought as Poseidon, but it's actually Zeus, throwing a thunderbolt. That's where that pose comes from. So this sort of Greco-Roman ideal of the perfect man as embodying a kind of idealistic perfection, right? Because they thought if a body was perfect, so was the person, which is a Greco idea. And ultimately, in queer culture, that's not changed. So I've picked up on that, and I choose to focus on what it means to be a gay woman who paints men, a lot of men. I think about the work of George Dureau. He's a lesser-known artist. He's a Southern artist who did an entire series of men who have lost limbs or born without limbs, all of them queer. And I think about him because not only did he depict them in very beautiful, respectful, and dignified ways, but they're ultimately people who did not have a platform, who we have demonized in culture. But they speak the same language. So ultimately, what I want people to think and feel when they look at my work is a kind of delight in the discovery of maybe the clever pairing of two things that are disparate, but also the question as to why I'm doing it, right? That it is not necessarily something to be abhorred, and that we all occupy parts of each other's expressions of what appropriate gender is. Done a few in color. Got them over there. That is Matt Dillon at 17 years old, if you know who he is. Rob Lowe. I'm a huge movie buff. Film directly influences the sort of narrative component of what I do, but also the identities, how that identity can change from one role to the next. But these are my favorite filmmakers, in case you're interested. These are challenging, but they're really great, and I love them. I think a lot about glitch. The easiest way to make a glitch is on your computer, you have an application that is on there automatically called WordPad. It's on any computer. And if you open up WordPad and you take a JPEG from the internet and you drop it in WordPad and open it up, it comes up as just code. And when you open that code in WordPad, it looks like text, You can go in and kind of like take your elbows and type in whatever you want. Words, jargon, nothing, like a monkey. And then you save it, and then you open it up as an image, you get a glitch. That's the easiest way to get a glitch. But obviously that's changed. Ultimately, what I'm interested in is the digital corruption of an image. So this is called data bending. And it's that corruption that is speaking to the aesthetic of what I've kind of acquired. Also watching cable that never came in. I grew up Yeah, single mom, didn't have any money. TV was like, loved it, but we would not have cable. So I spent a lot of time looking at movies that wouldn't come in because I didn't have cable. So it's that glitch that starts to corrupt the image so that you can't necessarily see the subject nor identify them. That's Joan Jett. She was of the Runaways. Kristen Stewart played her in a movie, right? And that is Leather Tuscadero, who was a reoccurring character on Happy Days, who I thought a lot about. Yeah, and I grew up in the 80s, right? So the male physique is a big part of these images, but they're distorted in a way that just simply objectifies them. Let's be direct. And some of them are of those spaces, those private spaces. Some of them are of celebrities. This is Cher in the 70s, because roller disco was a big thing. This is Christy, I can't remember her, Nick Nickel. She was a very popular actress as well. Pat Benatar, who was my first concert, in a leotard. Good God. And a lot of these images are actually taken from clubs. Like this is of Studio 54. So I have no problem remixing what I find if it creates the kind of composition and bodily structure that I'm interested in creating. And a lot of them do reference motion and dance. But a lot of them are about obscuring what you deeply want to see, which is the portrait, which is the identity of the sitter. But ultimately, the point is the objectification of the body. These become mandalas of a kind of meditation, a meditation on power structure that is there in viewing images of conventionally attractive bodies. And many of them are evocative of just simply the nostalgia of growing up in the 80s. She played Wonder Woman, by the way. So, there's a book you all should read. It's by a guy named J.J. Cohen, and he wrote a book called Monster Theory. It's good. And there are 7 theses, that are illustrated in chapters. And there are 2 that I am particularly attracted to. 1, the monster's body is a cultural body. It's about monsters in film. Monsters allow us to understand the culture from which they emerge because they embody fears, desires, anxieties, and fantasies of a certain cultural moment. 4, the monster dwells at the gates of difference. The monster usually represents the other, including culture, race, gender, sexuality, which in turn justifies its extermination. So he uses the paradigm of monstrosity as a parallel to how we talk about difference in culture. On a lighter note, I wanted to give you a little bit of an insight into my process. I'm a watercolorist, so the difference is I don't use white paint. I just save my lights. But I am a traditional photorealist in that I know what my image is going to look like before I paint it, which deflates a lot of people's expectations because they're like, oh my God, you're a machine, how would you do that? Some people paint for discovery, and I paint for process. So I know exactly what it's going to turn out like. I will project an image just like a traditional photorealist. I will draw it out with graphite, and then I will start in layers. And most of these watercolors have 10, 12 layers in a square inch, right? It's a labor of love, but it's ultimately luminescent because of the inherent transparency of watercolor, right? And I love that. I love that it requires that kind of intimacy. It also reminds me of like using your tears to like make them resoluble, you know, watery, as a sort of feminine weep, right? But it's the gaze, not the gaze, the gaze that I am very interested in. The gaze for feminists can be thought in 3 ways: how men look at women, how women look at themselves, and how women look at other women. And it was dubbed by Laura Mulvey in Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. It was an essay. You should all read that too. She's the first to coin it. And she talked about it in relationship to film. Another book you should read that would take you a weekend because it's this thin is John Berger's Ways of Seeing. Any of you who are into graphic design, digital media, photography, images like these? So, quote, "And so she comes to consider the surveyor and the surveyed within her as the two constituent yet always distinct elements of her identity as a woman. The surveyor is always presumed to be masculine, and the surveyed is always presumed to be feminine, even if it's not a woman. Thus she turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight." So if we think about the two representations of Mariah Carey versus Kanye West, the media promotes the idea that men are powerful and women are complicit with their own sexuality and are ultimately vessels for the male gaze. To do with them as you like. When men are viewing men in an image, it's considered to be homoerotic because he is always considered to be feminine. You are the man looking, he is the woman being looked at and consumed. So that's the idea here. Just last week, we have Kanye next to his wife. Notice the discrepancy and what they're equally trying to communicate. Granted, this is a really problematic interaction. He was like coercing her to do it. She didn't want to take her little cloth off. And there was a moment of exchange there that was basically, this is what you're doing. But either way, we see it every day. And its origins are in art history. And that is the point of that book. Men act and women appear. Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. So I paint a lot of men because it reverses that dichotomy. I am able to ultimately take on the role as a masculine representation. And I paint gay men in the way that they want to be painted, which is typically objectified, which is a very different power balance than has existed in tradition with women. But I still paint women. I paint them in a nostalgic way that is ultimately a meditation on the parts that make up the whole. So that's my lecture, that's my cat, that's my dog, and that's how you can follow me.